You're listening to the Music Book Podcast with your host, Marc Masters.
Hey, thanks for checking out the Music Book Podcast. I am Marc Masters. I've written 2 books about music, No Wave, published in 2008, and High Bias, The Distorted History of the Cassette Tape, published in 2023. On this podcast, I talk to music book authors about how they get from their first idea to a finished book, and all the decisions they make along the way. You might notice we usually post a new episode every other week, but I've been lucky to read a lot of great books lately and do a lot of good interviews, so we're going weekly at least for a little bit. Right now, we're in the middle of a kind of theme group of episodes about New York City. Last week, we talked to Ronan Gavoni about his history of NYC indie in the 2000s. And next week, you'll get to hear from Adele Bertai about her memoir of the women of No Wave in the late 70s and early 80s New York. This time, I got to talk with Kembrew McLeod. He's the author of many books, 2 of which are closely related. Parallel Lines, an entry on Blondie's 1978 album for Bloomsbury's 33 1/3 series, published in 2016, and the Downtown Pop Underground, New York City and the literary punks, renegade artists, DIY filmmakers, mad playwrights, and rock and roll glitter queens who revolutionized culture, published by Abrams in 2018. The 2 books are actually so closely related that the final chapter of Parallel Lines is actually titled The Downtown Pop Underground. Both these books cover all the amazing countercultural music and art being made in the 60s and 70s in New York and how it bubbled up into the mainstream. Parallel Lines, of course, focuses on Blondie, but also delves into the context within which the group operated, particularly as punk was crossing with disco and being influenced by hip-hop. The Downtown Pop Underground extends to many other musicians, as well as poets, playwrights, actors, venues, organizers, and much more. In both books, McLeod makes a compelling case for how all these pioneering creative people had effects on American culture that you can still see today. As he writes in Parallel Lines, Blondie was part of a social network of artists, musicians, intellectuals, and freaks who remade pop culture, queering it in every sense of that term. Parallel Lines was the multi-platinum punctuation point on a slow-building subcultural explosion, a fuse that was lit in the early 1960s by a handful of outsiders living in the margins of New York City. Today we inhabit a world that was conjured into existence by these downtown denizens. Kembrew's written a bunch of books, including Freedom of Expression, Resistance and Repression in the Age of Intellectual Property, and Pranksters, Making Mischief in the Modern World. Great writer, great guy, I've been friends with him for a while, and he has tons of interesting stuff to say about his writing process. As always, questions or comments, please send to musicbookpodcast@gmail.com and check out our Instagram account, which is @themusicbookpodcast. So here's my chat with Kembrew McLeod. I really hope you enjoy it. Most of my episodes, I start out with like, how'd you get the idea for this book? But we're talking about 2 books, first of all, so that's a little different. And plus, they're such related books. They have such, I mean, the last chapter of your Blondie book is called The Downtown Pop Underground, and then your other book is called The Downtown Pop Underground. So what I'm really would love to start with is sort of the kind of dual origins. I mean, the Blondie book came out in 2016, right? And then Downtown Pop Underground came out in 2018, but you had the idea for Downtown Pop Underground many years before that, right? Is that correct? Or?
Yeah. It's this interwoven project, and what you probably don't know actually is my Blondie book for the 33 1/3 series on Parallel Lines basically emerged from a book I wrote 22 years ago that I abandoned. And it was basically a book about punk and disco in the year 1977, using the year 1977 as a way to talk about punk and disco and the way that they're framed very differently in the popular imagination. And then I realized I didn't like the book at all. I literally put it in a drawer, and it only existed as a paper printed out manuscript for many years because I had a hard drive crash and I lost the original file for the 1977 book. And I didn't think it was publishable after I wrote it. I just needed to be a better writer, better thinker. So I tucked it away. And then I realized, because I had written a lot about Blondie, and when the call for new 33 1/3 book proposals came up, I thought, wow, Parallel Lines, even though that it wasn't released in the year 1977, it's getting at exactly what I wanted to get at in this book about the year 1977 and punk and disco. And so basically I mined that old book that had been sitting in my drawer for many years to write the Blondie Parallel Lines 33 and a third. While I was writing that and while I was doing interviews for that, I realized
Mm-hmm.
there's so much incredible stuff that could not fit in that tiny, 33 and a
Sure.
third book. And so by the time I was finishing the Blondie Parallel Lines book, the last chapter I intentionally named the Downtown Pop Underground because I was already writing the Downtown Pop Underground. And I was incredibly lucky to receive a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Award, which is open to
Mm-hmm.
both academics and non-academic writers. And so that bought me a year basically off of my job. Like it was a
Oh, wow.
full fellowship. And I know people who don't have academic jobs who've also gotten a public scholar NEH fellowship. And
Mm-hmm.
that's enabled them to also, they're often doing freelance work. And so they don't have to do the freelance work, so they can work on it. Anyway, point being
Mm-hmm.
is in order to write the Downtown Pop Underground, I needed the time to be able to do that, which I thankfully
Mm-hmm.
got from the NEH grant. But
Cool.
I also was spurred to write it because I couldn't fit it all into the 33 and a third
Uh-huh.
book. And
Uh-huh.
so, yeah, they're very much kind of interconnected
Mm-hmm.
books. And
Oh yeah, no, that's, I mean, it was interesting because I'd read them both before. I think, roughly around when they came out, but I never read them back to back like I did recently to so we could talk. And it was cool to like, I knew that the last chapter had the same title, but I didn't really think about how so tightly connected they are and so different they are at the same time. Like you
Mhm.
managed to make it so that like the Downtown Pop Underground is not just an expanded version of the Parallel Lines book. There's a lot
Yeah.
more to it than that, especially because it deals with much more than music. There's movies and so much theater stuff in there. But anyway,
Yeah.
to get back to the oranges a little bit, did you originally pitch the Parallel Lines as a book that there would be so much about everything around the record too? Because I mean, it's quite a varied series, but often people will just be like, chapter one, the first song, chapter two, the second, and or just like this is the story of how they made this record, and I don't care too much about before, too much about after. Whereas the Parallel Lines book is very much like the album is a character inside of a much bigger scene. Did you pitch it that way
Yeah.
to begin with, or?
No, I that is how the book ended up. Yeah, the album is basically a main character,
Hmm.
but the wider scene contextualizes it.
Hmm.
Actually, when I pitched the book, I went completely off script after they accepted my proposal because it was originally going to be written as a keywords book, like a
Oh,
Blondie Parallel Lines keywords book that would also allow me to talk about punk and disco and stuff like that. And
oh
gosh,
yeah.
I when I wrote that proposal, that must have been in the year 2014, and I can't really
Uh-huh.
remember anything beyond that. But it was
Sure.
I once I got the contract and then I started mapping out the book, I realized, oh, keywords books actually tend not to be super compelling. Like they don't sustain a momentum like a real book does, or like a book like
A
we're talking
narrative.
about. Yeah,
Sure.
a narrative,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
even the 33 and a third book. The history of that book is that it started out as a book about 1977 punk and disco that I discarded, decided to return
Hmm.
to and mine it for keyword entries, basically. That's how I pitched the
Ah.
33 and a third book. And then I realized,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, I started doing these interviews and I realized, no, I don't want to write it that way. I need to write it this
Uh-huh.
way, the way it ended up.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And then while I was writing it, I almost immediately said to myself, I need to write a much longer book about
Right.
the same scene, but whereas the Downtown Pop Underground that spans the years 1959 to 1976, and
Hmm.
the Parallel Lines, the album came out in 1978, was recorded in 77, 78. So
Hmm.
in some ways, that book came first, but the time period
Right.
that the album exists in happens after. So it's almost like
Hmm.
it started out as a prequel in some ways, but timeline wise, Parallel Lines was released after the narrative of the Downtown Pop Underground ended. It's all
Hmm.
very confusing, but
Cool. That
it's
makes sense
just
when you read the books.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and that you're right. They are both their own self-contained books. Like
Hmm.
I don't write about disco and the Downtown Pop Underground. I could have,
Hmm.
but it just would have made the book 100 40,000 words instead of 120,000 words. And so,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and for people listening who I do get the sense sometimes that people who listen, I hope, are people who are aspiring to write books. And I think it's a
Yeah.
good note to realize that some people, you might not know this if you haven't pitched a book before, is you don't have to do your proposal.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people end up doing their proposal because it works, but you're not locked into it. And so when you're writing a proposal, if you have an idea in there, put it in there. And then if it doesn't work when you're writing it, most publishers are fine with that as long as you give them a good book. You
Yeah.
know? So,
Yeah. And one of the things that I've liked about other episodes that I've listened to in this series is it does you do talk about the process of writing. And that's why I think that's one reason why I was going into the weeds about
sure, I
the
love it.
evolution of these two books. Yeah.
Yeah. And did you actually, so you wrote, that must mean timeline wise that while you were writing the Blondie book, you wrote a pitch and a proposal for the Downtown Pop Underground book. And did you,
Yeah.
and you took that to different public, did you have an agent at that point? How did that
I
one
do, yeah.
evolve?
I've had a longtime agent. Her name is Sarah
Mhm.
Lazen. She is
Mhm.
no longer taking new clients or taking new book projects from her established clients. She's very
Mhm.
careful to say she's not retiring. She just, I don't
Mhm.
know if you know Sarah, but or if your
I don't.
listeners do, but
Mhm.
she's an incredible pioneer, really. She started her own boutique agency in the early 80s. Her first client was Nelson George, and she was the
Oh,
first
wow.
person to the first agent to pitch a book on hip hop.
Oh,
Nelson's,
wow.
it was basically a packaged book on like hip hop culture, b-boying, b-girling, and
Mhm.
rapping, and DJing. And Nelson George is still her client, or
Oh,
for
nice.
over 40
Uh-huh.
years. Um,
Oh, that's cool.
and she was the first woman editor at Rolling Stone. She started out at Rolling Stone when they were in San
Mhm.
Francisco and then moved to New York. She stayed in New York. And anyway, she represented me for my first trade press book, Freedom of Expression. And I was an academic. Like my first book was published in 2000 on an academic press. And I
Mhm.
basically wrote Freedom of Expression as a kind of remix of my first book, my more academic book, pitched more to a broader audience. And it was where I tried out new ways of writing. And I had also been writing as like a music critic in the 90s. I was writing for Addicted to Noise, like the first online music magazine, and SonicNet, which bought them, and MTV.com. And I was doing occasional stuff for Village Voice and Rolling Stone. So I knew how to write for popular audiences, but this was the first book that Freedom of Expression was the first book where I really tried that out in book form. And Sarah represented that book. And so I had this idea for the Downtown Pop Underground after she knew I was working on the Blondie 33 and a third book.
Mhm.
And then I received the NEH Public Scholar. She helped she used that to help hook in publishers because I've never sold many
Cool.
books as like an author. My books don't
Mhm.
sell that much,
Mhm.
and so my previous trade book, Freedom of Expression, kind of tanked. But that's fine. The word got out about it. People knew about the
Mhm.
book. It just didn't sell
Cool.
what Doubleday was hoping. Anyway,
Sure.
I had this idea for the Downtown Pump Underground while I was writing the Blondie book, and she
Mhm.
pitched it for me. And the world of agents, like I imagine, I've just been really lucky to have had
Mhm.
this incredible woman represent
Mhm.
me who has done so many important books. She represents Ann Powers, and so just
Oh, cool.
lots of incredible folks.
That's awesome. So, what was kind of the interaction in terms of, I mean, I imagine you had done all your research for Parallel Lines before you got the Downtown Pop Underground. So, but I'm sure you also used some of that and then expanded it out. And you mentioned you talked to you did interviews for Parallel Lines. I mean, Parallel Lines has a ton, is a dense book in terms of information. There's a lot of different people
Mhm.
discussed a lot. You probably did quite a few interviews for it and quite a bit of like reading a lot of books going back to old Village Voices and New York
Yeah.
Rockers and things like that. So I imagine had you built up sort of a thing that you could go back to get started on the Downtown Pop Underground?
Well, it's just a subject matter I've always been interested in. So I was always reading books and
Mm,
digging
hmm
into the archives of old Village Voices or whatever. And I had already written that book on the year 1977, Punk and Disco. And I kept up, like I kept reading every new book, every link that I came across to an old source. And so I had all this information in my head. My head was full of this stuff. Then it started overflowing when I started doing interviews. And I also got really lucky because I had become friends with Lisa Jane Persky through the pop conference that Eric Weisbard had been running for many years. And I knew her from the New York Rocker. I cited her, writing about Blondie in the New York, in an article she wrote for the New York Rocker. I knew that she was on like a founding staff member of New York Rocker. That's how I knew Lisa. I didn't actually know she was like in When Harry Met Sally and had like an acting career. I knew that's the sort of person she is. She's not a big bragger. So when I told her that, oh yeah, I landed the deal for the Blondie Parallel Lines book, she was like, oh, you know about my history with the band, right? It's like, well, I knew you wrote about them for New York Rocker, but I didn't know that, her boyfriend was Gary Valentine, the bassist in Blondie, and that she, that the band, still remembers her very affectionately. And so she was the one who got me set up with like Chris Stein and Gary Valentine, and
oh, that's cool.
I think it was actually Chris who introduced me to Debbie. But then I started doing all these interviews. People who weren't, who were in the scene, like Richard Hell and other folks. So yeah, my head is overflowing with stuff, and I know my word count is 30,000 words. That's when I have the idea to. It's like I remember the day I realized this. It's like, do I really want to write another huge book? Yes, I do. I really do want to write the Downtown Pop Under the Ground. Like right after I had been grinding on this other book, and so yeah, it was basically my head. Can't contain anymore, can't all fit in this one little book, and so that they become these kind of sibling books.
Right. Cool. And one of the, in terms of differences and things, like the theme is basically almost exactly the same. It's that the underground became the mainstream because it was in New York. That's why you call it the pop underground. Those seemed like conflicting terms. But what you're saying is basically what was bubbling in the underground because they were in the media capital of the world ended up influencing the mainstream. And a lot of us don't even realize that like things that we listen to on the radio now only happened because of what was happening by these weird outsider artists in New York who were putting on their own plays and having their own concerts in weird spaces that you wouldn't expect and things like that. But one of the interesting things I think that's different about it, beside it, Downtown Pop Underground book being just bigger and having more to it, is that you really orient it around the geography of the city, especially in the beginning. But really, that's a persistent thing through the whole thing. Is like you're very aware of, this happened down here. And I mean, Lisa's a good example. She lived near some of the places where they were putting on the plays, and she ended up acting in them. And it helps with just a sense of how it was a community, not just a bunch of disparate people making art. I'm curious how you came to that idea to orient that book in particular so much around geography. I mean, there's even maps in there where you say, here's the places I'm talking about in this section and stuff. And was that an idea you had from the very beginning, or was it something that kind of evolved as you were realizing where everything was?
It was an idea that I had from the very beginning. I knew starting out the way I was going to write the Downtown Pop Underground is it's in part limited to this 1 square mile area of downtown New York, from the West Village to the East Village and Lower East Side and Soho. But I also, wanted to make readers who hadn't walked the streets of New York like I had. I've spent as much time as I possibly can there without living there. Lots of friends who have lived there. I've just over the years places to crash for free, so I could also when I was writing the book, like I wouldn't have to pay for hotel rooms because I have friends there. So I had I realized the only way I could really tell the story is if the readers themselves could orient themselves within these spaces, and because it's the bigger scope of the book isn't just limited to this 1 square mile area of downtown New York. It's the relationship between downtown and midtown, for instance, which during the post-war period was the media capital of the world. The downtown was only a few subway rides away from, CBS News. And the very first national exposure that the Velvet Underground got was in the year 1965 well before their 1967 album was released, introduced by Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite introduced a new segment on basically underground culture, underground films, and you see the Velvet Underground playing, along with interviews with Jonas Mekas. So yeah, that's why I had. I don't know if I originally started out committed to the idea of having maps, but very soon, early on, I realized a reader needs to see like the fact that, La Mama Theater is essentially right around the corner from CBGB.
Right.
And I can say that, I can type that out in words, but to actually be able to see these cluster of venues that are either theatrical venues, music venues, art venues, discos like the Loft. The original Loft is also, very close to CVGV. Anyway, one of the privileges of having my job, which is a professor at a research university, is I was also able to work with some really great undergraduate research assistants who did a lot of the heavy lifting of searching for the original addresses and double checking and fact checking what the addresses are. Sometimes they're contradictory, going through old Village Voices and finding out where all these different places are. So then I had a spreadsheet that Morgan Jones, my research assistant, she helped me with. And then I worked with another graduate student actually in urban planning who did the maps for me. But the one last thing I wanted to say about the process of writing the book is Morgan Jones, my research assistant. This is one of my favorite stories as a teacher, as a writer. She's from northeastern Iowa, grew up in a small town, basically. And her dream was basically to become a trade press editor at a place like Bloomsbury or wherever. But I know from having the Iowa Writers Workshop here, and my wife is the editor of the Iowa Review, which is our flagship literary journal. I know how that system is very geared towards the Ivy Leagues, and there's a pipeline from the various Ivy League schools to trade presses. Kids from northwestern Iowa are least likely candidates to get this. Well, anyway. Fast forward, she had just graduated by the time Downtown Pop Underground came out. She had landed an internship at Bloomsbury. And by the time I had my book launch in October of 2018, she had been hired as an assistant editor, and now she's moving her way up through Bloomsbury. Anyway,
that's great.
I just
That's
love
really
it.
cool.
Like this person who's obviously really talented, but also didn't have the same kind of privileges that a lot of her work colleagues likely had in landing those jobs. Basically, she started out being immersed in New York City as my research assistant, digging up all these addresses and doing all sorts of other work. And she had this really broad knowledge of the city by the time she was done working with me. And then she's living in New York City doing exactly what she wanted to do. Even though there are constraints and there are biases and privileges, you can still make your way into the area of the writing world that you want to. There are still doors that can be opened.
Yeah, that's cool. And a special bonus, she knew the city before she moved there. So she had learned where everything was. That's pretty cool too.
The other thing, the reason why I brought it up is it takes a village to write a book sometimes. Sometimes if it's like a partner, spouse or whatever. And in my case, it took a village, like a little academic village because I couldn't have done all the things like making those maps without people working with me. I love working with people. I guess that's what I'm also saying. We think of writing as a solitary thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that.
Right, that's true. Yeah, sometimes the dichotomy is a film's a collaborative thing, and a book is a solitary, but it's not always that, always that way at all. Yeah, and it's interesting because you mentioned sort of mapping out and having kind of a plan for where everything was and figuring out the geography and stuff. I'm curious how you were able to organize the many things that are covered in both books, but especially the Downtown Pop Underground, because there are so many characters. And in the beginning, you say, I'm going to concentrate mostly on the ones who were moving in and out of the different mediums. But even that there could be hundreds, and And also, you wrote a book that wasn't supposed. It's not like it's Andy Warhol and the New York Pop Underground or Debbie Harry. It is flatly the New York Pop Underground. So you're talking about a lot of different people. You're having their stories weave in and out. We revisit, like Lisa comes up a lot, and different theater directors come up a lot, and so you had to figure out a way to keep these people all kind of, you're sort of juggling them in the air throughout the whole book. And I wonder what the challenges are of that, to make sure that, like, well, did I talk about him enough? Did I talk about her too much? Do I need to check back in? I mean, some of it, I guess, chronologically helped that the people were naturally popping up in each other's work and things like that. But I'm curious if what it was to structure that whole part of the book.
When you were asking that question, I was reaching back and looking into one of my drawers because I have a stack of 3x5 index cards that basically I use to map out the whole book, because going back to that metaphor of my head's overflowing with information, and it already has been for like 20 years of consuming this stuff, but then I'm doing more interviews. How do I possibly organize this book when there's so much going on? And what I decided to do was basically take all the most like interesting stories, compelling stories, or moments, and write each moment down on an index card. And in my office, I fortunately have an entire wall that's corkboard. And so basically what I ended up doing was on one wall was basically a whole bunch of index cards, much like a writer's room in like a television show when they're mapping out like a season. And I created like, so there were rows that were the 50s, 60s, 70s. I knew I was going to end at the 70s. So I had rows, and then I had columns for I settled on the key figures who represent each scene, starting with Harry Katukas, who represented introduced the first pages of the first chapter. He's the gateway into the world of off Broadway and underground theater. And then Andy Warhol, who covers both visual art and film. And I won't go through all the different characters. I did for music, I basically had, it was the only case where I had two characters, Debbie Harry and Patti Smith. They're both adopted. They both came from New Jersey. They are, in many ways, the way they presented their images, yin and yang. So I sort of used them as a combined composite character. And so then I created the rows of the decades and then the columns of the scenes / main characters. And then I just started moving the cards around. And that was the only way I could figure out what the scope of the book was going to be without going down too many blind alleys of just writing, oh, this is really interesting, blah, blah, blah. And then before I know it, my deadline's over. No, I was under the gun. Like I had to start going back teaching, by, I had to get it done by a certain timeline. And this is how I did it. And I am sharing this in detail because it could be helpful to other writers as well. It was the very first time I ever visually mapped out a book on corkboard, and it doesn't. If you don't have corkboard, you just tape it to your wall or whatever. And so that's how I did it. That's how it was. All these little index cards that I was just looking for, but they're not in reach. So yeah, that's how I did it. That's how I did it.
That's cool. Yeah, that's great, because I think you struck a great balance of covering a lot of people without going too far down one hole, and also not like I never felt like when you bring someone back up, I'm like, who is that? And I have to go back. I mean, you did it in a nice rhythm and pace, which isn't easy to do. There can be times when you're like, do I know if the reader is going to know who I'm talking about at this point or that point? And that's a challenging thing to put together.
Yeah, and the one last step is Scrivener. It was the first time I ever used the writing software Scrivener, which is used a lot in television writing, movie writing. Novelists use it, scholars use it, and basically it's organized basically around this index card idea. So it's structured exactly like what my wall was structured like. And so I was able to, I literally took what I had handwritten on the index cards and I essentially started the book. Scrivener basically allows you to like move index cards around. So like I didn't necessarily know what exact order that they should be in. I didn't know how at the beginning when I started writing this how this information was going to cluster into chapters, but between being able to visually see it against my wall and then having that translate into the software that allowed me to essentially shuffle index cards around, that's how I arrived at the structure as well.
That's cool. I use Scrivener on my last book too. It's a really good piece of software, and especially for I mean, it's not that expensive. It's worth,
No?
if anybody who's, even if you don't have a book contract or whatever, if you're just even doing a book, it's worth getting. I think it has a lot of really cool.
How did you find it useful? I'm just curious as a writer yourself.
I actually just found that it was a really great way to have the research. You could put research really easily into these folders that are easy to find
Yeah.
and easy to correlate. And like, it's something you could do in Google Docs or maybe Microsoft Word, but I just think
No, it
it's just
doesn't.
so much, the user interface is so much faster and easier, more intuitive than any of those
Yeah, and I'm
things.
still using it. So I'm working on another
Uh-huh.
book, big project, and
Oh, cool.
it needs Scrivener for that also.
That's cool. That's cool. One of the things that I also loved about the Pop Underground book is that very descriptive in terms of what was going on, especially even though this is a music book podcast, the plays are a big part of it, and there's music in the plays. So, and plus we're just talking about your book, so it doesn't matter to me if it's music or
Yeah.
not. But but especially the plays, very descriptive, very like, I mean, I felt like I could almost see them happening. Yeah, I mean, obviously you weren't there. You're probably talking to people about things happening. Probably they were written about in the press, but I mean, that's still that to me is a tough challenge to sort of recreate with some confidence something that happened that you weren't there for. I'm curious how you
Yeah.
approach that.
It
Yeah.
started with interviews. So I would go into the
Mhm.
interviews having read everything I needed to know about the stuff that the person I'm interviewing was involved in. But in terms of what you're describing in the book, a lot of that is me rewriting the words of my interviewees and I'm
Mm-hmm.
asking them questions like, put me in your shoes. Tell me about
Right.
tell me about what's going on stage or whatever. And so that's what allowed me to translate it. And then my
Mhm.
knowledge that I'd gained beforehand, all the stuff I read so that I could write my questions to them,
Mhm.
that informed it. And then the last bit was archival research. The book contains quotes from plays and
Mhm.
underground musicals, the dialogue and stuff like that. And a lot of that stuff it can only be accessible in archives. So I went to the New York Public Library, the Performing Arts Center library, where they have a lot of the stuff from Cafe Chino, which was the first off Broadway venue. I went to La Mama, to their private archives, and
Oh, wow.
took photos with my phone. So I have tons
Mhm.
and tons of most of which I never used, but at
Sure.
least I learned about the milieu by
Mhm.
immersing myself in it, so that I could, in sometimes fairly pithy ways, summarize things, but also
Mhm.
like as you say, it's descriptive, so I'm able to give some atmospherics, I guess. Uh-huh.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, but that's
Yeah.
how I did it. A lot of it came from the actual interview subjects myself. When
Mhm.
it feels like you're in the play or you're in the audience, it's because I interviewed people
Mm.
who are in the audience or who are performing.
Yeah, no, I thought it was really effective. I mean, I really felt like I was there in a lot of the cases. And it also just made it more, even though sometimes I think it's tempting to be like, do I need to go into much detail? I think the details are often what make the creativity really of these people show through. Like, a certain play had something happen in it that you're like, oh my God, that's wild. And that
Ye-
makes you realize the boundaries they were pushing and
Yeah.
the things they were willing to try.
And the last thing I wanted to say about theater, since we're talking about it, is I hadn't really read a book that really explicitly made the connection between the underground theater, off Broadway theater scene that
Hmm.
started in the late 50s and was really a true force of nature in the downtown scenes through the 60s and into the 70s. I'd never seen anyone really make that connection between underground theater and punk, for instance,
Hmm.
and really sort of make the case for everything that we talk about punk pioneering, the breakdown between the barrier of audience and performer, and so on and so forth. That had
Hmm.
already been done by this group of people. And yes, I've read punk histories and knew that Patti Smith was involved in some off Broadway plays, and Jane County, of course, was
Hmm.
involved. But when I realized that I couldn't go into too much depth about that connection in my Blondie book, that's when I was like, okay, that is really kind of the story that I want to tell in this much bigger book. Yes, a lot of different scenes are going on. I'm talking about Warhol. I'm talking about the Mimeo Revolution and the underground like poetry scene and all these different things. Yes, all the stuff is going on in the downtown pop underground, but the real through line is that, that practice of that confrontational practice that was originally developed in underground theater. And I didn't think that most people knew that. And I basically wanted to make the book about that.
Right, right. And that kind of rhymes a little bit with the Blondie book in terms of another thing that I found really interesting about it that is probably still true today and probably will be for a long time for those of us of our age or older. People don't really understand their punk roots. I mean, they get lumped in with punk like Talking Heads do in television, and a lot of people will listen to those and be like, "This is punk? Oh, it's proto-punk," and it gets into the weeds, and you don't necessarily have to define it all. But they were pretty much by far the most successful mainstream act to come out of the CBs and Max's scene and everything. And I think that one of the points you make in the book is that kind of blurred that they had so many interesting things going on in their past but they also were unapologetically, we want to be pop. And if someone would say, you guys are pop, Chris Stein's answer was, that's cool. It's a challenge to me to make something catchy out of the things because at first they were considered sort of the least together band on the scene.
And the least likely to succeed for really a while.
Right.
Yeah. And the other thing that I wanted to say about Debbie Harry in terms of like helping readers sort of understand the layers of history that are presented in Blondie's image is that, Debbie Harry got her look from the drag queens like Jane County and other folks that she and Chris and the band are hanging out with, that Lisa Persky's hanging out with. And so once they go mainstream and Debbie Harry posters go up on the walls of every like early 80s boys' bedroom virtually, these boys don't realize that they're looking at an image that's a woman imitating a drag queen, imitating a Hollywood star from the 30s. And I just wanted to spell that out for readers also, just because I think that history, knowing that history and these layers of history and how we come to our present moments, all of that's important. And Blondie's really interesting because I write about this in the 33 the third book. I can't think of, they had a public access show for like basically the length of the time in which they're global superstars. And I just cannot think of any other band that would have had a weekly a public access show other than that band. And they continue to maintain their underground roots through that show. And they also became pioneers of this new medium of, DIY television. And that's probably one reason why I write about that in the Downtown Pop Underground. I write about like the history of video and how these artists are using video and then public access to sort of get their world out into screens that then eventually ripple into other screens. And then next thing you know it, you have RuPaul's Drag Race on network television.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And then for people who aren't familiar, there's a section on that show. It's called TV Party in my No Wave book as well. And I mean, it's not only was it public access television, which like you say, they could have been working on something much more mainstream, but they decided to do. It's about as abstract and weird as you can get on public and intentionally. It's not just public access done by people who don't know what's going on. It's very intentionally weird. And, in the middle of it, there'll be Chiron on the screen, Basquiat's writing poetry that has nothing to do with what's going on, and Walter Stedding is playing like a music stand as his drums, and it's great. I mean, a lot of them are on DVD and also on that Night Flight streaming service. I highly recommend people go and watch it because you will think Chris Stein and Debbie Harry were not, you'll realize how interested they were in all kinds of things, not just being a pop band.
And there's also a good documentary on it. If you don't want to go through all of if you want basically TV Party curated and present like all the weirdest, best parts, there's a documentary called TV Party that people should check out.
Yeah. So another thing I was thinking about, mostly with the Downtown Pop Underground book, but also with the Blondie book as well, is that both of them have kind of I don't know if it's chronological necessarily, but a momentum of like this is what was happening. We're kind of there a little bit. There's a little bit of a present tense aspect to it. Even I think you do a good job, especially in the second book, the Downtown Pop Underground book, of touching on themes that were happening, if issues of sexism, drug use, the police being a constant presence, without it being like, and now I will tell you why this was important, which obviously
Hmm.
you're a good writer, you're not going to do that, but it could have been a little bit more like a meta, more of a themed book where like I'm making these points and here are my examples, as opposed to like this is how it happened, and as things happen, you can sort of see why these issues were important. Is that something you kind of think about when you're writing?
Yeah, well, it was something that I thought about with the Downtown Pop Underground book. It was the very first
Mm-hmm.
time it was the very first time I wrote a book organized around characters, an ensemble
Mm-hmm.
cast of characters, but
Mm-hmm.
no characters. And and that was what I figured would make the book compelling. Also, it was a practical solution for me. How do I talk about all these different scenes that these people are representing, the different scenes? How do I condense all this information? And the way you do that is by following someone's life, their progression
Mm-hmm.
as an artist. Debbie
Mm-hmm.
Harry, who like moves to New York City like in 1967, 68 or so, is dabbling in this and that. And you get to see her
Mm-hmm.
progression through to, well, becoming the front woman of Blondie. And same with Patti Smith
Mm-hmm.
or Andy Warhol. Yeah. So I was
Mm-hmm.
absolutely thinking about how to avoid writing a book that's about ideas and concepts, of which there are many in the Downtown Pop Underground. And the way I decided to do that was, yeah, by going back to that that cork board on
Mm-hmm.
my wall,
Mm-hmm.
by kind of mapping out these intertwined lives,
Mm-hmm.
and basically taking the reader through this history from 1958 to 1976 by like having them follow people rather than
Mm-hmm.
the issue of gay bashing and so on like that, so on and so
Mm-hmm.
forth. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And given that you were very character centric, a lot of these characters aren't around anymore. Or, when you were writing the book, they were getting very old. You might not have been able to talk to all of them. I mean, and
Yeah.
a lot of people died from there were AIDS deaths
Yeah.
involved and things like that. And so it's a slightly sensitive thing to be writing about people who aren't able to tell you their perspective. I get the sense that maybe like Lisa and like Christian Hoffman with Lance Loud, and so you were able to at least sort of get some feedback from people who were there, and did they give you some things about like, well, you really got to say that one great thing about him, or even did you show some of it to some people to say, do you think I'm getting this person accurately enough? I mean, I know that can be a tricky
Yeah.
thing too, because everybody has their own POV, and it's not always the truth per se, but I'm curious
Right.
how you.
Yeah. I was under deadline, so I was not actually able
Mhm.
to show more than Lisa and maybe a couple other people some
Mhm.
passages from my book
Mhm.
after it had been written
Mhm.
to make sure that I'd gotten it right. I just had to
Mhm.
trust myself that I got it right. And
Mhm.
fortunately, the reaction from everyone except for one person was basically, you got it. Like Christian
That's
Hoffman,
great.
he was like, I thought you were going to write a book about, like, I thought this was going to be another book on CBGB or whatever. And no,
Uh-huh.
like you understood like my world, and Lisa said the same thing. And Lisa organized one of the book launches in New York, at a location in Greenwich Village, and a lot of the people from my book came to that event. And Lisa said,
Oh,
everyone
cool.
who was interviewed for the book, stand up. And there were probably 15, 20 people or so. So I
That's
got to
cool.
talk to people. So I feel like I got it. I just had to
Mhm.
trust myself that I had already asked the right questions of the people, because I can't
Mhm.
interview Lance Loud because he died of
Right.
HIV complications, and so
Mhm.
many other people. So I would talk to their friends, and in
Mhm.
much the same way when I was talking about earlier, I would ask people to put me in your shoes as you're on stage doing this crazy theater, the ridiculous
Right.
performance. I
Mhm.
also asked, yeah, I was very thorough in talking to folks,
Mhm.
especially people who weren't around, who couldn't talk themselves. The one person who complained, it's more comical than anything because
Right.
she's someone from the underground theater scene, and it's such a theater
Uh-huh.
person thing to do. She emailed me and said, "You said that I was in several blah 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 performances, but I was in like 28 or something like, and
Right.
in my mind, several is, I guess maybe not quite 28, but anyway,
Uh-huh.
she just needed to
That's
get it off her
funny.
chest, and she liked the
Sure,
book,
sure.
and
Uh-huh. Oh, that's good. That's good.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that could
But
have been that would
like
you
you're,
if,
yeah, but from interviewing people and writing books based on
hmm
interviews, people can be pretty touchy about,
hmm
how they end up getting represented in the book, or they don't get represented in the book either at
Right.
all. Like you
hmm
end up interviewing someone and it works better as background material than like a
Right.
direct quote. And that was true
hmm
of, I imagine maybe some people probably got their feelings hurt because I didn't actually directly quote them. Made sure to list them, made sure
hmm
to mention them in the narrative. But yeah, you know how
hmm
tricky that can
Sure.
be.
Yeah, yeah, it can be tricky. I mean, I think the good thing with both of these books and in general, writing about these kind of scenes is you're doing it to show how interesting and creative these people were. So you're coming at it from a point of empathy and
Yeah,
also the barriers they had to break down and the pressures they had on them. And so, you're not writing a salacious, and you're honest about them, especially with drug use things. I mean, those things have to be dealt with. But I think I think a good way, you probably were able to trust yourself somewhat because you knew you weren't trying to make anybody look bad, and
yeah,
that
yeah.
is an important part of it, I think.
And also it was, you know how interviewing works with like you get introduced to the right person by the right person, and a lot of
hmm
that happened. Lisa Persky is a great example of that. Chris Stein introducing me to like Debbie Harry and setting me up with interviews with her. Just so in so many instances, I was introduced to someone I was interviewing by someone that person trusted, and so that
hmm
also helps build like
hmm
this web of trust, basically.
Yeah, something that made me think of something else for a second when you mentioned that Christian Hoffman said to you, "Oh, I thought this was just going to be another CBGB's book." Did it surprise you at any point, maybe even from writing that initial 1977 book or all the way, that there was so much that hadn't been, because there have been a lot of books about New York in the 70s,
Hmm.
musically especially, but all kinds of things, and yet there's so much that wasn't. I mean, especially the theater stuff, but even musically, you found some things that I hadn't read about before, some people that I hadn't read about before. I guess it was just such a rich time that all the stories won't ever be told. But did you ever surprise yourselves like why am I the first person writing this book? You
Yeah,
know?
I think maybe because it was pretty hard to write a book like that, and I
Yeah.
happened to be like the right person at the right time, who
Uh-huh.
happened to be friends with Lisa Persky, but just loved her as a person and thought she was awesome as like a founding staff member of the New York Rocker, but didn't know about this
hmm
whole other part of her life. Well, anyway, I think it was a combination of being the right person. That is, I had
hmm
spent a couple decades, or I mean, more than that. I'd been reading about
hmm
this. I went to New York City for the first time in the year 1988, and I
Uh-huh.
bought the Velvet Underground Uptight book at a St.
Uh-huh.
Mark's Place
Nice.
record store,
Uh-huh.
along with like a replacements live at Maxwell's that eventually was released. I still vividly remember this purchase that set me on this road. Actually, the next year, I did my very first interview with Lou Reed. I write about it in the
hmm
acknowledgments section and the
Uh-huh.
author's note in the book.
hmm
It was my very first interview. It was with Lou Reed. I got backstage on his New York tour, and I
hmm
basically buttonholed him. I didn't have a recorder, but I wrote down everything right after I interviewed him. And the funny Lou Reed story that I'll share is, in addition to me interviewing him, I also had him autograph my Velvet Underground and Nico album and his new New York solo album. And I brought my lucky pin that I had had like all these amazing people, artists sign already, and it was my talisman. And then he keeps my lucky pin, and he's signing everyone else's autographs, and he then quietly leaves and starts going down the hallway to his dressing room, and I call down, "Mr. Reed, Mr." And he stops, and then he pivots on one heel and looks back and then comes back at me. And I'm 18. I look like I'm 15. I'm like, excuse me, Mr. Reed, like this is kind of like my lucky pin, and I was hoping I could have it back. And I'm like holding it up, and he's like, and he just drops it in my hand and then just stares at me. And then it's like 10 seconds at least. And then I'm like, sometimes I bet like in situations like this, does it suck to be a rock star? And then he smiles and he puts his hand on my shoulder, doesn't say
Nice.
anything, and then turns around and leaves. But that was my very first
Okay.
interview. And it was, and I
Uh-huh.
actually wrote down what he said. And I ended up
Mhm.
quoting one of those lines in the Downtown Pop Underground, whatever that was, like 35 years later. But anyway, back
Right.
to, I got sidetracked. I think I was the right person to write this book because I'd been filling my mind since 19, for since the
Mhm.
mid 80s, ever since I started getting interested in music and culture. And then I was like during the first decade of this century and the half of the second decade, I was still consuming all this stuff. Then I happened to know the right people to introduce me to the right people. Like it all kind of came together. And I just feel like it
Mhm.
was, I'm not a religious person. I'm joking when I say this, but it was like divine
Mhm.
providence. Like it just all came
Uh-huh.
together and the
Mhm.
timing worked out. I was able to pull off my deadline, everything. And
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of stuff was going on in that book. And I
Mhm.
hope I did a good job with it.
Oh, I think you really did. It's funny. I think we might have even talked about this on Facebook once, like many years ago. I'm pretty sure I was at that show, that Lou Reed, that same Lou Reed was in Richmond, right?
Richmond, yeah, up
Yeah,
by
yeah,
the Half
yeah. Because I
Japanese
was,
Opens and Mo
yep,
Tucker, or they
yeah,
backed Mo Tucker.
yeah,
Oh,
I was
that's
living I
awesome.
was living in Williamsburg, Virginia, and we came over for that show. So yeah,
Well,
it's
and
funny.
this is how I got backstage. I
Mhm.
was sitting waiting for the show to start before Half Japanese started, and there was a woman and like four children right in front of me and my friend, and she's handing out backstage passes to them. And I was an obnoxious 18-year-old, and I was like, "Hey, you wouldn't have to have an extra one of those, would you?" And she like counted. And she counted. It's like, yeah, I do. Do you want it? And I was like, yes.
Oh,
And
nice.
I had brought because I'd been lucky enough to I'd been going to a lot of shows where I'd been making it backstage. So I brought my, the Velvet Underground and his New York solo album along with my lucky
Uh-huh.
pin. And
That is awesome.
that was a great show, though. That was a great show.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Great tour too. Yeah. It's interesting talking a little bit about the idea that, how has this book not been read before? Have you read the Jay Hoberman book that came out last year? I don't know if you
Oh my
read.
God, it's so good. It's so good. And
Yeah.
that's
And
something also. Yeah.
very,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
it's yeah, very, very similar to what it's kind of a book that like it proves that this book, there's still so much more to write about, but at the same time, it overlaps with yours a lot. And
Hmm.
I think he did a really interesting job. But I feel like, if you, even though he might not have read your book and even known about it, if you hadn't done yours, his almost couldn't exist in a way. They were overlapping in really good ways and have different because he was kind of more, he's older, so he's there kind of more there for it. But
Yeah.
anyway, I just thought that was interesting. It was proof that how fertile this subject still is.
And just one other example, I wanted to give a shout out to Cynthia Carr's book on Candy Darling, her
Oh yeah, that book's great.
biography. It kind of dives down into that world, the same world that
Hmm.
I describe, but in a so much more rich way because it's a biography of a person, and it's about
Hmm.
their life world. And what I was trying to do was I couldn't dive that deep, and so
Uh-huh.
definitely if you're interested in the subject matter, not just you, Mark,
Hmm.
but listeners, I
Great.
highly recommend Cynthia Carr's book, biography
Hmm.
of Candy Darling.
That's cool. Yeah, I've read it. It's great. It's awesome. It's really, really good. And I guess the last thing to sort of maybe talk about a little bit is, a lot of the times what I have on the show is authors who just finished, or the book just came in. They might have finished it a year ago, but the book just came. It's a little fresher. You've had sort of the hindsight aspect that these books have been out for a little while at least, and so you've been able to think about them a little bit. It sounds like they were both very like rewarding experiences and are things that you're still, like you said, you had a lot of this stuff in your head and you had this opportunity to get it out, but I'm sure it's still kind of always kind of bubbling for you because it's something you thought about so much. And just curious if you have any reflections back on either one in terms of like what kind of you learned from doing them or what has been satisfying about having done them.
I just think I learned to be a little bit of a better writer through the process of
Mm,
writing both the Blondie 33 and a third book and the Downtown Pop Underground. One thing reflecting back on both books that makes me feel good is there's nothing in them that I really wish I had done differently. And I
That's
can't say
nice.
that about
That's
all
really
my
nice.
books.
Right.
And I think also because I'm continuing to work on some of these stories in the next book that I'm working on slowly. Maybe that's the reason why I wouldn't want to change anything in the previous books, because
Mm-hmm.
it's, I kind of see a lot of the stuff that I'm planning on working on in the next few years as kind of additive and interconnected and threading through, some other books that we haven't talked about that aren't in the scope of this book. Like I've written a book about making mischief in the modern world and pranking. And that's
Mm-hmm.
actually something that like I've done as a kind of performative practice at time. I have
Right.
like,
Uh,
my Robo Professor
right.
costume
Right.
who has interrupted, for instance, Bill Clinton
Uh-huh.
when he came to University of Iowa stumping for Hillary in 2008, and I
Uh-huh.
interrupted his speech and demanded that he apologize to Sister Soldier for misrepresenting her words
Wow.
when he did what he did during the Sister Soldier moment in 1992. And so a lot of the stuff that I plan on working on is just
Mm-hmm.
all interconnected and woven into these two books, like a lot of
Uh-huh.
the impulses, like the
Uh-huh.
the disruptive impulses that I'm
Uh-huh.
documenting by these artists.
Uh-huh.
These are stories that I'm going to continue, and so maybe that's also why I just don't feel like they need to change. I mean, yes, maybe there's like a sentence that I would have been like, yeah, I could have
Right.
changed the wording of that. But no, thanks for asking that question, because it's the first time I
Sure.
realized to myself, or I realized myself that, oh yeah, I'm pretty
Mhm.
satisfied with these two books, and that's
Uh-huh.
not true of all of my books.
That's cool. That's awesome. Well, I really appreciate you talking to me about both books, and yeah, like whenever your next one is done, I'd love to talk to you again about that one too. And yeah, just I really appreciate it. It was great to go back, and it was also really neat to. This is one of the first times I've done a podcast where it was a book I had already read, but then I read it again, which
Yeah.
is great because that's why I keep all these books. I want to read them all again. You
Yeah, I have tons of books behind me also, and I really
know.
appreciate you asking me on. I love your podcast, and
Oh, thank
thanks
you.
for including me in it.
The Music Book Podcast is produced, edited, and hosted by Marc Masters. Our theme music is by the great band Savak. Our logo was designed by Walter Carlton. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a rating and a review wherever you hear it. And thanks so much for listening.